Vienna, winter of 1477. The city sleeps beneath a shroud of snow, its spires glinting like the tips of spears beneath a frozen moon. Inside the grand halls of the Habsburg Palace, candles burn low, their flames trembling against the marble walls like ghosts that never left. It was here that a marriage began, not of love, but of empire. In episode 1, we watched that first royal wedding unfold, a union between Maximilian of Habsburg and Mary of Burgundy, a ceremony gilded in gold, yet cursed in silence. That wedding was the seed, the moment two crowns bound themselves together and sowed the roots of a dynasty that would one day rule over half the known world. But power has its own appetite, and what began as strategy soon became obsession. Each generation learned that a war could be avoided if a daughter was sacrificed. And so, the Habsburgs made peace their battlefield, and marriage their weapon. The echoes of that first wedding lingered long after the music stopped. You can almost hear it, the hollow footsteps of brides being led down corridors of duty, their faces painted in porcelain calm, their eyes screaming from behind veils of obedience. Each vow they spoke tightened the family chain. Each kiss sealed another century of control. The courtiers called it divine diplomacy. But in truth, it was blood alchemy. The Habsburgs learned to forge empires without swords, to conquer without spilling the blood of men, only the spirits of their women. As Europe fractured under endless wars, the Habsburg palaces remained eerily quiet. No cannons, no cavalry. Just the steady rustle of silk gowns and the faint scratching of quills signing away lives on royal parchment. The dynasty's motto would come to define them. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. But the happiness was an illusion, one paid for by daughters who never saw their homes again. And as their bloodlines folded back upon themselves, peace began to look more like punishment. Because sometimes, the cruelest wars are fought in silence. Tell me, where are you watching from tonight? And if you haven't already, subscribe to Underbelly Bloodline, where we peel back the silk and find the rot beneath history's golden crowns. They called it wisdom, a strategy so elegant it could bend kingdoms without firing a single shot. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. It began as a proverb, whispered by courtiers, etched into letters, and murmured in the marble corridors of Vienna. But before long, it became something more, a commandment, the creed of a dynasty that learned how to conquer through the altar instead of the battlefield. In the candlelit courts of the late 1400s, the Habsburg men sat at long tables heavy with gold and wine, their fingers tracing maps inked with borders they no longer needed to fight for. A daughter here, a cousin there, a quiet agreement signed in the soft light of diplomacy. And with every union, the empire grew. But beneath the velvet and ceremony, something colder began to stir. Because peace, when built on possession, rots from the inside. The daughters of Austria were born into a bargain they never made. Their destinies decided before they could even speak their own names. Infants in lace cradles were already being weighed, measured, and promised. Their bloodlines treated like precious currency to buy another decade of peace. Behind palace doors, mothers wept in silence as heralds announced their daughters' betrothals to distant kings, uncles, or cousins they would never meet until the wedding day. Each girl was raised not to dream, but to endure, not to choose, but to obey. To the world, it looked divine, the Habsburgs uniting Europe with grace instead of violence. But if you looked closer, you could see the cracks forming beneath the crowns. The peace they crafted was built on broken hearts, and the more they married within their own blood, the more the family tree began to curl inward, like a vine strangling itself. Every bride became both bridge and burden, carrying the weight of kingdoms on shoulders too young to bear them. Each ring, each vow, each whispered "I do." A thread in the quiet web of control that would one day choke the dynasty from within. And still, the motto echoed through the generations. Let others wage war. But no one spoke of the other half of that truth, that some wars are waged without swords at all. In the shadowed nurseries of the Habsburg palaces, the lullabies were not songs of comfort. They were lessons of duty. Tiny princesses swaddled in silk grew beneath ceilings painted with angels, yet even the angels seemed to look away. From the moment they drew breath, these daughters were not born for themselves. They were born for someone else's throne. Their tutors came not with affection, but with instruction: how to bow without trembling, how to smile without revealing sorrow, how to speak just enough to charm a king, but never enough to threaten him. They were raised to be decorum itself, silent, perfect, pliant. By the time a Habsburg girl reached 12, her future was already a closed book, her face studied like a map by foreign ambassadors, her dowry debated by men who would never know her voice, a treaty disguised as a child. Inside those gilded rooms, obedience was praised as holiness, tears were weakness, desire was sin, and love. Love was the one thing forbidden to those born royal. They were taught that peace was worth any price, but no one told them that the price would be themselves. So they learned to hide, behind lace, behind laughter, behind the heavy curtains of duty. Their portraits captured only what the empire wanted to see: porcelain skin, serene eyes, a beauty so still it felt almost lifeless. But if you looked closely, you might see the truth: a faint red mark on a lip bitten to keep from crying, a stiffened hand gripping the folds of a gown too tightly, the faint tremor in the corner of the eye, rebellion buried alive. Each of them, Maria, Eleanor, Margaret, paraded like jewels in a display case. But they were not daughters. They were contracts bound in flesh. And though the world called them peacekeepers, their silence built the cage that would hold the Habsburg bloodline for centuries to come. Because when you teach a generation of women to obey, you do not create peace, you create ghosts. The corridors of the Habsburg palaces no longer echoed with the sounds of battle, but with the cries of newborns. Each wail marked not the joy of a child's arrival, but the signing of another treaty, the sealing of another alliance. In those marble halls, every cradle was political. A sleeping infant could unite kingdoms, calm old feuds, or save an empire from ruin. The Habsburgs no longer waged war with swords, they waged it with bloodlines. Midwives whispered prayers as they wrapped royal infants in silken cloth, unaware that they were swaddling a future curse. For every birth drew the web tighter, cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, blood circling back upon itself in the name of peace. And yet, in the eyes of kings, it was a triumph. No cannon fired, no soldier fell, just a mother weeping quietly in her chamber, as her newborn's fate was sealed in ink before it had drawn its first breath. Outside the palace, Europe burned: France, Spain, the Ottomans, kingdoms clawing at one another for dominance. But inside Vienna's gold-leafed walls, the war was colder, quieter. A dynasty expanding not through conquest, but through conception. Every heir was a thread connecting two thrones, fragile, precious, and already destined to unravel. Because peace built on shared blood is never peace at all. It's suffocation. The Habsburg genealogy began to twist upon itself like an old vine, its branches no longer reaching outward, but curling inward, strangling its own stem. Children born with pale skin, weak hearts, and the same jaw that jutted forward like a herald of deformity. Doctors called it coincidence. Priests called it God's will. But the truth was simpler and crueler. It was the price of control. The empire had learned to keep its enemies close, so close, in fact, that they shared the same blood. And with each generation, the curse grew quieter, deeper, more permanent. What began as peace through marriage had become a slow, hereditary war. One fought in the wombs of women who never chose the battle. Because sometimes peace doesn't come from love. It comes from the cage of blood. The halls of the Habsburg palaces were lined with portraits, hundreds of them, each one staring back with the same pale face, the same cold blue eyes, the same blood that refused to die. At first glance, it looked like glory. Generations of emperors and empresses, saints and soldiers, framed in gold and oil. But look closer, and you begin to see the repetition. The same names: Maria, Ferdinand, Charles. The same jaw, the same hollow stare. The family tree no longer branched. It curled inward like a vine that had forgotten how to reach for the sun. What had once been a lineage of rulers had become a cycle, a slow spinning wheel of blood and duty. Each new heir looked more like a reflection of the last, as though time itself had stopped moving forward. And with every generation, the portraits grew quieter, frailer, more ghost than flesh. The physicians of the court began to whisper of strange afflictions, Trembling hands, weak hearts, minds that wandered into fog. Some were born too sick to stand, others too fragile to rule. Yet the marriages continued, binding cousin to cousin, aunt to nephew, blood to blood. Each union an attempt to preserve the dynasty, and each one cutting it closer to its own extinction. In the flicker of candlelight, those portraits seemed almost alive, their painted eyes following the viewer down the hall, pleading for something unnamed. A curse doesn't always scream, sometimes it just waits. The genealogists called it purity of blood, but purity is just another word for decay left undisturbed. Within the grand archives, clerks inked the same names over and over until the pages blurred. Maria, Ferdinand, Charles, and somewhere between the lines, humanity was lost. The Habsburgs had built their peace upon perfection, and that perfection became poison. A dynasty so obsessed with preserving itself that it began to consume its own reflection. By the dawn of the 17th century, their blood carried both the empire's legacy and its curse. And behind every portrait, behind every royal smile, history began to whisper the same thing. This is how the bloodline breaks. Power was never given freely in the House of Habsburg. It was bartered, traded in whispers, and sealed in blood. But not the blood of soldiers. The emperors of Austria had long learned that the surest way to win a war was not with armies, but with wombs. Their courts glittered with chandeliers and silver, their tables heavy with roast and wine. Laughter echoed through marble corridors, but underneath the music was something colder, the sound of a bargain being made. While men toasted to peace, a daughter's life was quietly signed away. The Habsburg emperors called it strategy, but in truth, it was sacrifice, dressed in velvet. Behind every royal feast was a girl in another room, her hands shaking as she practiced smiling for a marriage she did not want. Her father called it her duty. Her mother, bound by the same curse, called it fate. These young women were the empire's most valuable currency, living contracts meant to hold the peace between rival kingdoms. Each time a treaty trembled, another bride was chosen, a political offering wrapped in silk, and when she left for her new home, her carriage rolling through the silent streets of Vienna, the city would cheer, but in her heart, she carried only the sound of her own chains. In letters that history nearly buried, some of these daughters confessed the truth, the loneliness, the despair, the dread that followed them to foreign beds. Their bodies became vessels for empire, their children pawns before they could crawl. The crown fed on its daughters, and the empire thrived on their silence. For the men who ruled, this was the bargain. They kept their power, they kept their peace, and in exchange, they surrendered the souls of their own blood. The Habsburg emperors believed themselves wise, men of vision, men of faith. But perhaps in the end, the only difference between a conqueror and a tyrant is who they choose to sacrifice, because every peace bought with innocence leaves a stain that no crown can hide. The carriages came before dawn, lacquered black, crested in gold, their wheels whispering over the cobblestone streets of Vienna. Inside, a girl sat motionless. Her gown was a cloud of white silk, her hands folded tight in her lap to hide the tremor. Outside, the people cheered, but she was not leaving for love. She was being sent. Across Europe, the churches rang their bells for the brides of the Habsburgs, daughters given like offerings to seal another fragile peace. They called them empresses, duchesses, queens. But if you stood close enough at those weddings, you could hear the sound of chains rattling beneath the organ's hymn. Each ceremony looked the same: the trembling girl, the solemn priest, the stranger waiting at the altar, her face powdered pale, her eyes hollow with quiet terror. When the vows were spoken, the crowd would weep for joy. But she would not weep at all, because she had already learned that tears change nothing. The road ahead led far from home, to foreign castles, to strange tongues, to husbands chosen not for affection, but advantage. And once she crossed that border, she ceased to belong to herself. Her letters home grew shorter, then ceased altogether. Some were intercepted, some were burned, and some brides simply vanished into the folds of history, their portraits left unsigned, their graves unmarked. The world remembered their titles, but not their names. In every corner of Europe, another pale bride whispered her last prayer as the church doors closed behind her. The sound of her silk faded into the distance, like a ghost leaving its body, and yet the empire marched on, bloated with victory, deaf to the cost. For each alliance forged, a woman's light went out. For every peace declared, another voice was silenced. The palaces of Europe were built upon their footsteps, cold marble halls that still echo with the faint, invisible cries of the women who never came home. The Habsburgs believed they were marrying for peace, but what they were truly marrying was sorrow. The palaces of Vienna still glittered, but the gold was beginning to rot. The chandeliers still burned, but their light had grown dim, flickering against portraits that no longer resembled beauty, only endurance. The empire appeared unbroken from the outside, but inside the marble walls, the Habsburg blood was quietly collapsing. It began as whispers among the physicians, cautious, fearful words spoken behind closed doors. They noticed it first in the children, trembling limbs, weak hearts, eyes that struggled to focus. Then came the faces, the unmistakable protrusion of the jaw, the heavy lip, the drooping chin. A feature that began as inheritance soon became a warning. The Habsburg jaw, carved by centuries of inbreeding, etched into the dynasty like a signature of decay. Servants learned not to stare. Painters softened their strokes, hiding deformities beneath shadows and lace. But no brush could conceal what was written in the blood. One emperor after another fell to the same quiet afflictions: seizures, madness, infertility. Heirs were born, but few were strong. Those who lived long enough to wear the crown often did so with trembling hands and haunted eyes. Their peace, so carefully preserved through arranged marriages, had turned into a hereditary plague. Europe began to notice. Behind the courtesies and coronations, foreign diplomats whispered they have bred themselves into extinction. But the Habsburgs refused to see it as curse. They called it divine will, a mark of God's favor, as if deformity itself had become sacred. Generation after generation, they married closer, drawing their circles tighter until no one outside could enter and no one inside could escape. The same blood that had once built an empire now poisoned it from within. And through the corridors of the Hofburg, servants swore they heard echoes, soft weeping, footsteps that ended too soon, voices repeating the same names that had haunted the dynasty for centuries. Maria, Ferdinand, Charles. No wars, no invasions, no assassins, just the slow collapse of flesh and memory, the price of peace made visible at last. Because when a family builds its empire on control, it does not fall with a scream. It fades with a whisper. The empire that once swallowed continents was now eating itself alive, not with swords or fire, but with silence. A silence so heavy it pressed against the walls of every Habsburg palace, where power had become ritual, and ritual had become rot. They had conquered without armies, ruled without mercy. While others waged war in the mud, Austria waged it in the bedroom. Every alliance was a wedding, every treaty a birth, and every daughter sent away was another brick in a crumbling dynasty, one laid atop the graves of women who had no voice, no will, no choice. For centuries, the Habsburgs believed they had mastered fate. Their control was divine, their lineage eternal, but what they called stability was only decay in disguise, a disease passed down in silk and ceremony, each generation more fragile than the last, each heir more ghost than king. Behind the gilded doors, empresses prayed for sons who could stand straight, speak clearly, breathe easily. The priests called their suffering holy, the physicians called it hereditary, and the world called it justice. Because the same control that built their empire became the poison that ended it. They caged their daughters in politics and their sons in bloodlines. They ruled through obedience until there was nothing left to obey, only the echo of their own arrogance. Vienna's grand halls, once filled with the music of Mozart and the whispers of queens, now echoed with something else, the sound of decline. The empire, still proud in its posture, began to bend, not to foreign armies, but to the weight of its own perfection. No one could stop it, not the priests who blessed incest as destiny, not the scholars who painted deformity as divine, not the kings who mistook control for order. In the end, the empire learned a truth older than its crown. That control is not power, it is suffocation. And as the Habsburg bloodline thinned into pale ghosts of what once was, Europe finally looked upon them and saw not rulers, but relics, proof that even empires built on peace can rot from within. when their peace is paid for in flesh. The halls of Vienna are quiet now. The chandeliers still glitter, but the light feels colder, refracted through centuries of ghosts. Portraits line the corridors like mourners at a royal funeral, their painted eyes following you as if to ask, was it worth it? The empire is gone, its map torn apart by time and war. Yet the Habsburg name lingers, not as a banner of glory, but as a warning written in bone. Theirs was a dynasty that mistook control for peace, obedience for devotion, and silence for love. Each marriage they forged to stop a war only birthed another kind of suffering, daughters who became treaties, sons who became symbols, and an empire that became a mausoleum, polished, revered, but dead all the same. Now, the echoes of their lives remain trapped between stone walls and candle smoke. The royal diaries, sealed with trembling hands, speak of fear disguised as duty. Their children, pale, fragile, and haunted, carried within them the sins of generations. Not sins of violence, but of sacrifice without mercy. In every portrait, the faces blur together, Maria, Ferdinand, Charles, all sharing the same distant eyes, the same weary mouth. It is as if the bloodline forgot how to change, how to feel, how to live beyond its own reflection. Even now, when we whisper their name, it carries both reverence and ruin. Because the Habsburgs did not fall in battle, they faded, slowly, beautifully, tragically, into silence. And in that silence lies their truest legacy. The quiet proof that peace, when built on pain, becomes its own kind of war. A war fought not with swords, but with wombs. Not for glory, but for endurance. Not between nations, but within blood itself. Some say their curse still lingers, that somewhere in Europe, in the veins of the forgotten, the last echo of that name still beats faintly, carrying centuries of secrets and sorrow, fade to black. A single whisper remains, faint as a dying prayer. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. Then, the sound of a church door closing, final, hollow, eternal,